Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take another look at our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we're going to take a look at our registrant class. The idea behind this video is we're going to add an additional field that we might find useful in the future. And what we want to do is we want to focus on the process of updating our class to reflect the addition of that field. Now, things that we're going to address in this video are going to be things like setting the initial value, perhaps creating another constructor, the appropriate getters and setters, and then updating our toString. So this video assumes that you've already spent a significant amount of time on your registrant and your registrant demo. So to begin with, let's talk a little bit again about what a registrant is. Perhaps it's a registrant for a conference, an event, or something along those lines. And the idea being is that you simply want to keep track then of the information of the registrant, but then perhaps also the registrant will be allowed to bring some additional people with them. So in other words, you can think of it then as being able to bring guests to a pool party or something along those lines. The idea here is that we want to just simply keep track of the total number of people that might be at the event, including the registrant themselves. And so what we can do here is we can simply add an additional field, and in this case, it's going to be an integer. Again, this will work for any other data type. We're just going to focus on the process of how we're going to update this class. But I'm going to start off with a private variable that I'm just going to simply call guest count. And I'm going to go ahead and use the pattern of the lowercase for the G to indicate it's a private variable, and then a capital C. You will also potentially see it like this. Again, neither really matters to me, but the idea is that we want to keep the private variables indicated by the lowercase letter for the first letter in the variable. Now, what we want to do is, at this point, go through each one of our constructors and decide, is this critical information at the point of creating the instance of the registrant class or an object? The answer is probably not, unless you need to know the number of guests at the construction time. You probably don't have to have it as an essential requirement. In other words, we don't have to add it to each one of our constructors. Instead, it can just simply be an optional constructor or an overload for the existing constructors. But we do want to fall into the habit of initializing each one of our private variables as we go along, so we don't have any null values. And so to begin with, what we want to do is inside of our first constructor, where we simply require the username, we want to set the initial value for the guest count. And in this case, we're going to equal to 1. And the reason I picked 1 is because I want to include the registrant in the count. Again, we could set it equal to 0, and then we could have a separate guest count. We could count the registrants. Again, it depends a little bit on the purpose behind your application. Now, if we come down to the next overload, you'll see that we also are not yet providing the guest count. And so again, what we want to do is we would want to go ahead and initialize the value. And in this case, our guest count would again be equal to 1, because again, we are requiring our username for this particular constructor, but the first name and last name are optional. So we at least know that if we get a username, we're going to have a basic registrant object. And at this point, then we'll have a guest count, again, equal to 1, that indicates the registrant is a guest at this event, which brings us then to the necessity for another overload. And again, it depends a little bit on the purpose of your application. And so should we, for instance, provide an additional constructor where we can pass the guest count, in other words, you know all the information up front, at the time of constructing the object? And the answer is sure, why not? It may help later on in our application. And so what we can do is we can simply copy and paste our existing constructor, the one that provided, or rather requires 3 arguments, and simply add then the 4th argument of the guest count, spelled correctly, of course, as the 4th argument. And at this point, then what you can do is you can, of course, initialize it equal to 1 to start off with, because that is an appropriate default value. But then what we can do is we can validate the guest count just like we validated the other arguments in the constructor. And in this case, then what we want to do is we want to check to make sure our guest count is in fact not less than 1, because that wouldn't make any sense. Or our guest count greater than 4, and 4 is kind of arbitrary. I'm just saying that you can only have 4 people in a party, for instance. And then else, what we would want to do is if either of these two conditions are true, we simply set then our guest count to our default value, which again is slightly redundant because we've already done it above. And you can choose to remove one of those assignments. But if it doesn't meet either of those criteria, in other words, if it is a valid value, then we simply use whatever was passed to our constructor. And at this point, we have updated our constructors to reflect that additional argument, and it now allows for us to create a valid object. Now, at this point, then we also want to go through and update our validation function, in which case we've checked the username, the first name, the last name, and we simply need to have one other else if. And again, we're going to put the same criterion in. So if our guest count is less than 0, or guest count greater than 4. And in this point, we aren't necessarily going to assign a default value. We are just going to say results are going to be equal to EE333.status.incomplete, which is going to indicate that for whatever reason, we have an inappropriate or incorrect value for our guest count. Again, we could at this point consider simply resetting the guest count equal to 1. However, if you think about it, a validate function really shouldn't do anything to the existing data in the object. It should simply verify that it is correct. Alternatively, you could argue that it should potentially be responsible for fixing problems in your object. At that point, we should probably consider writing another function that implies to the caller that it is doing something to your object. Now, continuing on down, we have our getters and setters for the various fields. And so we probably want to consider adding one more. Again, probably in the order in which we have our private variables would be a good idea. But again, we can simply insert these getters and setters where we feel appropriate. And we'll start off with our get guest count. And so it will return an integer value. And we will follow then the pattern of the lowercase g for the get. And again, we can camel case guest count in a variety of ways, rather. And then what we'll do here is we will simply return this dot guest count. No changes made to the existing value. And then we want to follow this up then with another setter. In this case, we're going to keep the pattern that we established in an earlier video where we use the data type for the data that's going to be set in the field as the return value for the setter. And we will call this one set guest count. Again, this is arguably a debatable approach. The alternate function signature would look like this, where we had a void set guest count. We're going to take just a second at the end of this video to talk about why you would do this and what the benefits are. And at this point, then we would again want to do some sort of validation, matching our existing range here. And so what we can do here is we can have a if statement that simply checks to see, I forgot my argument here, my apologies. So with our setter, we have to have an integer guess count. And at this point, then we will once again just check to see that our guess count is less than 1 or guessed count greater than 4. And if that is the case, then we will not set the guessed count. And under the else branch, we will set it. So in this case, it's going to be this dot guessed count equal to guessed count. And then to keep the pattern that we had from our earlier setters, we do validate our object, and then we return the results, or in this case, are this dot guessed count. In other words, if it has not been changed, then you will get the value that was previously stored in guessed count. And if it has been changed, then you will get the new value that was passed to the setter. Again, this approach is a little bit unorthodox, but it gives you the ability to verify that your setters are in fact setting the value. And so you can do it in a one-step approach that we'll see in just a second. The last thing that you want to do with respect to your class is that we want to go ahead and update our toString. And again, here you can decide how you want to print this out, how you want to put the table together, for instance, just make it look aesthetically pleasing. And we simply want to return the guessed count followed by a new line. Now you should notice at this point that we're doing an implicit conversion from an integer to a string at this point. We are not doing any explicit function calls. We can cover those in a later video, but for right now, we're going to get a value, ideally from 1 to 4. And so at this point, it's probably time to go ahead and test some of our changes to see how we're doing. I'm going to go back over to our fundamentals demo, and specifically, we're going to take a look at our registrant demo, which has gotten rather busy at this point. And the idea here is with our registrant demo function, this public static void registrant demo, is it's supposed to be sort of a catch-all test for our registrant. You can create as many of these functions as you would like, but I'm going to continue to reuse this registrant demo, and I'm simply going to turn on and off lines of code for my various tests. Now, again, you could simply create just another function to accomplish the same thing. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to simply comment out the existing lines of code, and I'm going to borrow again one of my variables here, that my registrant objects. And I'm simply going to go through and I'm going to create now a registrant. I'm going to go ahead and borrow the border again that I was using because I like the way that it looks. And then what we can do is we can set up our try catch that is required for our constructor in the event that we do not pass it a valid username. And then again, what we can do is we can follow the same template. As a matter of fact, you can just copy and paste some of the code. We're going to just simply print out whatever message was stored in the exception. And then inside of here, we'll start again with one of our registrant variables. And we're simply going to start first with our base. Again, I'm going to just use my ID here, which also happens to be my email address if you've got any questions. And then what we can do is we can test this by simply printing out the value for the toString. All right, now what we want to do is we want to go ahead and make some of the changes that we made earlier, including setting our first name and setting our last name. But this time we won't bother with printing out the values for the toString in between that. We're just simply going to do both activities. And then additionally, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set our guest count. Again, my autocomplete seems to be having a little bit of fun with me here. And in this case, what we want to do is we want to start off by setting it to a valid value. In this case, I'm going to start off with 1. And then what we want to do is we want to see if we've made changes to our registrant toString. And again, to keep it separate, we're going to put another print line with that nice bar in the middle. And so the idea here is we're going to see what happens to the toString method after calling the constructor, then setting some of the fields, and then recalling the toString method. Ideally, what would happen is that we would go from a completed, or rather incomplete object to a completed object. At this point, let's go ahead and build it. We'll come back over to our command line. Notice I'm in my classes folder. And so I'm going to go ahead and call my EE333.FundamentalsDemo. Registrant demo. And at this point, you can see that I have a username of G. Myers. My default guest count is 1 because we're assuming the registrant is the only guest. And then I'm populating the rest of the fields. And most importantly here is that my status is now complete after giving all of the information. Now, what we'd like to do is we'd like to go through and we'll just simply prove that our setter is actually working here by changing this value to 2, build it one more time, rerun this, and you'll see that, yes, in fact, I am updating my guest count to 2. And then just to check to see what happens if we put in a larger value than what should be tolerated, then you'll notice here that I have my guest count back to 1 in my second toString call. But the object itself is viewed as complete, even if the guest count is incorrect. Now, at this point, we can simply play around some more with our setters, particularly our set guest count, to see what the behavior would be. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to leverage this set guest count's return value. I'm going to start off by setting it back to 1. In other words, I'm going to leave that part alone. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to come down here and I'd like to make a change in how I check to see if the guest count has been set. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead and create another variable here. I'm just going to call this one guest count. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to capture then, using this guest count variable, the results of attempting to set the registrant _ 01 set guest count method. And in this case, I'm going to hard code it. But the idea here is I want to see if it gives me a way of handling my logic here. And so to verify this, I'll have a system.out.println. And again, I'm just simply going to put a little bit of text in here. So guest count, and then I'm going to append the return value, this guest count variable. And we'll rerun it. And you'll see that got a little bit too much information here without a border. Let's go ahead and take just a second to go ahead and put one more border in here. And you'll notice here that my guest count is the return value rather is 1, which was the value from when it was initialized to the default value, even though I attempted to pass 5 to it. And we can also go ahead and set this up here to 2, just so you see a little bit of a change here. And so you can see that initially it starts off as 1. However, when I pass it a valid value, it changes it to 2. But then when I pass it an invalid value, it returns the current value for the guest count. Again, hopefully this is clear what the benefits are. The idea here is that in my set guest count, I simply return what the value currently is. And if it has not been changed, then what this does is this provides you with some sort of return value that then you can include in some logic. And let me show you how you would go about doing this. And so you can simply leverage this return value. You can do this all in one line, or you can do it in multiple lines. But basically, what you can do is you can check to see if the value that you passed to the setter matches the value that was returned by the setter. And in this case, what I want to do is I simply want to print out in both scenarios what that value would be. But more importantly, if it's equal, have a system.out.println. This is changed. And then under the else, a system.out.println that says unchanged. And so if we build this and see what happens here, you'll notice that when I pass an incorrect value, in other words, one that's out of range, it tells me that it is unchanged. If, however, I were to come in here and change this to a valid value, it would tell me that it was, in fact, changed. Now, assuming that you did not have that matching data type return value approach that we have been using, and instead you leverage this void set guest count, you can still accomplish the same thing. You just have to do it in a 2-step approach. Now, again, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a second here to clean this up just a little bit so that you have a nicely delimited table here. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more system.out .println before I do any more operations, just to clean this up. So let's build it one more time. And then you can see here where we are focusing here just solely on changing the guest count. And again, what we're going to do is we're going to repeat this. And so I'm going to do this a couple of times here. I'm going to throw in another border. The difference in this time around is I'm going to simply set the registrant _01 set guest count, and I'm going to set it to a value that's out of range. but I'm not going to leverage the return value. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage the getter. In this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to check now that my registrant underscore 01 get guest count equals to 5. And yes, I do realize I'm hard coding these values in. You would ultimately want this to be a variable or some sort of input from the user. Then what you can do here is say system.out.println changed, else system.out.println unchanged. So you can see here that it fundamentally just turns into a two-step process. Again, no big difference functionally in what you're trying to do. In both cases, you are simply trying to print out or notify the user whether or not you've been successful in the change to the object. I'll make one more quick modification here so that you can see what's going on. Again, we're going to build it. And you can see here that in this first set, we changed it because it was a valid value. And in the second set, we left it unchanged because it was outside of the range. Again, a little bit of cleanup here. Simply going to provide one more border, and you can hopefully see then the difference here. Again, a one-step process in this first approach where I leverage the return value from the setter, or a two-step approach where you first set it and then you leverage the get method. Again, this is more classical. This is probably going to be less controversial, shall we say. But again, fundamentally, you can do both. So again, hopefully you found this video useful. In this particular example, I just demonstrated how to do this with an integer. You can do the same thing with any of your methods here. You can check or validate your return value. And the last thing that I would want to point out real quick is in your constructors, you want to make sure that you have validated the object assuming that you've got all of the information. And so if you notice here, we have added our guest count and we've initialized the value in our constructor that accepts a username and in our constructor that accepts 3 parameters. And then we've simply just leveraged the input argument in the fourth one, or third constructor rather. But in none of these examples have we actually validated or checked to make sure that all of the information has been provided. Now, by default, all of the information could not be provided in this first example because we only had the username. In the second example, we also now did not have all of the information. So in this case, you'll notice that our default status may not be able to be complete. In other words, would you argue that you have to, in fact, have some user input for your guest count if you are to consider the object complete? And so again, this is a little bit optimistic here, but more importantly is in this last constructor, you have now provided all of the information required to complete the object, and therefore the object is now complete. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me, and thank you for watching.